Hello, Tim Kerrin here from Mortgage Choice in Kingsley. Normally I do these monthly videos from inside the comfort of my own office, but it's such a beautiful day outside that I thought I'd come and share it with you. It also hasn't been a monthly video for some time because we have been absolutely inundated with the unprecedented level of inquiries. In June, when HomeBuilder was announced, the number of new customers that came to my business that month was 4 times what a good month normally is for me. And then July wasn't far off that massive record. August was a little bit lower. September seemed to calm down, and October seems to be okay. And we've all managed to survive this. I've managed to survive this because I have a fantastic team around me that are really supportive, but I'm not going to lie about it. We are all absolutely buggered. And the result of all that is now we are submitting a lot of loan applications as well, and so we're still really busy. But I thought it's time to connect because a lot has changed since I last did, and there's a few little points that are worth talking about. The first is you may have heard of the government proposing responsible lending obligations being removed from the law that applies to me. So I want to talk about that a little bit. And secondly, the federal budget came out recently. There's not too much there that's necessarily news that affects you as a customer of mine. One was the reduction of some income tax rates for hardworking Australians. Not really sure about those of us that are lazy, whether they get a tax cut as well, but the hardworking ones definitely get a tax cut, so that was good. There was some stuff about granny flats, but there was also some stuff about the being able to write off as a self-employed person any asset you buy. So that recently changed from a maximum limit of 30,000 up to 150,000 when COVID hit, but it's now unlimited. You can claim any plant and equipment you buy that meets certain criteria, apparently. In the year in which you buy it, rather than having depreciated over time. At least that's my understanding from having a chat with my accountant about it. The other thing I had a chat with my accountant about was what got announced about granny flats. That was actually a fair bit more confusing. But my understanding of that now is that essentially, if you have a granny flat and you have a formal arrangement with a family member to rent it from you at a market rental, so that it's a formal arrangement, then if you sell it down the track, you won't pay capital gains tax on the granny flat portion. It'll all get counted as part of your owner occupied property for the purposes of that ordinary exemption. That's my understanding. That's not my advice to you, but it's an interesting topic to potentially get advice about if you're considering buying a granny flat. That's my understanding from talking to my accountant about it, but it's early days, and as often happens, one thing I've learnt this year is that when the government announces something, even when the Prime Minister or the Treasurer says it, that doesn't necessarily mean that's what's actually going to happen. The devil is in the detail, and that comes later once the law gets through Parliament, and once in this case, the Australian Tax Office gets the ability to actually interpret the law, which then becomes their job, or ASIC in the case of other things. And so, in the case of the other thing, that's the National Consumer Credit Protection Act having responsible lending obligations that apply to me and dictate how I and mortgage brokers and lenders need to approach helping people borrow money. That's up to ASIC to interpret that law. And one of the biggest bugbears that has affected our industry lately, if you've been a customer that's got a home loan from me in the last few years, you'll know exactly what this is like. Having to explain and estimate your living expenses is a result of a law that essentially says we need to make a reasonable estimate of your ability to repay your loan, factoring in a reasonable estimate of your living expenses. And there's been a court case between ASIC and Westpac about that. It's been debated, and ASIC was shown to be wrong. ASIC lost a court case against Westpac where a federal court judge basically said, no, it's okay for the customer not to estimate their living expenses. That's a grossly simplified version of it, but we have this situation where the law says one thing, a federal court judge says a varying version of that, and then a lender interprets it differently, and ASIC turns out to be the one that's meant to be regulating how we do this, turns out to be the one that's got it wrong. So we're all kind of waiting to see how things pan out. One thing that was very heartening though, a couple of weeks ago, was to see it get announced that the government wants the responsible lending section of the Act that applies to us and tells us how to do things, which in part, for example, talks about living expenses is going to be removed from the law, which I don't think you'll find anyone in our industry that that thinks it's a bad idea. Certainly my perspective on it is that it's helpful for customers to think through their living expenses, as an example, but I wouldn't say that there's, as far as I can tell, that there's any correlation between thinking through it and your ability to repay your loan, because the reality is we're already being quite conservative when we're figuring out what people can afford anyway. And the reality is that if things go wrong in your life and you suffer, one of the last things to go is the home loan repayment. Nobody wants to fall behind on their home loan repayment and have and lose their house. So I think that is now being acknowledged by the government, and hopefully what we see at some point in future is a relaxation of these rules. Living expenses is just one small part of it. Another part would be needing to justify an exit strategy. That is how you can reach retirement age and have no owner-occupied debt when we're applying for a loan. Which means that if you're 60 years old, it's perfectly fine for us to lend you money. It's perfectly fine for me to apply for a loan and for a bank to approve that loan, as long as we have an explanation about how you could get to retirement age and not have any debt. Now, that makes a lot of sense, but there's situations where good people trying to do something that makes sense actually are unable to. And that's what we found with these responsible lending obligations. From my perspective, the biggest impact they've had is to stop reasonable people doing things that they should be able to do, in my opinion, and in their opinion, and in the opinion of pretty much everyone else involved. What I hope will happen is that common sense can prevail now, that we have the latitude to be sensible rather than onerous and dealing with complete nonsense instead. So nothing changes right now in that regard. You still have to estimate your living expenses today. I don't know how long it will take for the law to change, let alone for ASIC to then reinterpret the law, let alone for any other regulator involved to effectively give banks permission to start behaving in a different way. But at some point in the future, my hope is that things get easier. Right now, they're not. Right now, they are just as ridiculous as they have been for the last few years, and it's still a complete debacle. The government has explained their proposal as something to help out the flow of credit. That would be great if it happened right away, but I can't see it happening right away. I can see it taking a decent amount of time. So watch this space, and I'll keep you posted when things change. About the only other thing to say is that interest rates are still ridiculously low. We're seeing fixed rates in the very, very low twos, and variable rates have come down. It's possible to get a variable rate around 2.5% as well now. So if you haven't looked at your interest rate for a while, we can probably do something about it. So feel free to get hold of me and ask me for help if you think there's anything I can do. And if there's anything else you want to know, things that have been changing lately that you'd like to hear my thoughts on, please let me know and I'll put it in the next video. Cheers.